Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Danger on Delmarva. My name is Rhonda Jefferson, and I'll be your host as we explore the crimes that have happened around the Delmarva Peninsula. And today will be the second part of an episode that I started a couple of months ago. Um, as I've mentioned before, I do have some chronic health issues, and they have really been hitting me hard over the past couple of months. I'm still not even feeling great right now and have had to cancel or postpone some of my physical therapy because of it. But I did want to get this episode out. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I know myself if I started to watch a video or listen to any type of documentary or podcast, and there's multiple parts, I want to get back to the second part as soon as possible. So, I do want to get this out before the end of the year, but I also don't know if I'll be able to get another episode out by the end of the year. So I do want to apologize for the delay on this one, but I also don't want to make any promises or guarantees about what might be upcoming over the next few weeks, especially as I'm getting worn down a little more quickly than before. The physical therapy I've been going to has helped in a lot of ways, but again, I also get kind of worn down. So, I do think it's helping more than not, but at the same time, there are other things I can't quite do as much of. But the last episode, we were going over the Linda Charbonneau case, which is what it's pretty much known as, though it involved so many different people that to just give it the name of one person, I think really doesn't do justice, especially to the victims that were involved. So, to give a very brief recap, Linda Charbonneau had lost her first husband when she was young, and she had had two children. Melissa, though, is the younger of the two, and she's the one who was really the focus as far as being an accomplice in the case. Linda Charbonneau had married John Charbonneau, and he had raised her children like they were her own. And along the way, though, Linda either fell in love or I might say thought there was more advantages to later date and eventually, after divorcing John, marry his nephew Billy Sproates. And so, as one might guess, that was kind of a unique family situation. You had where Linda's children probably looked at Billy more as a cousin for most of their lives. And on the other hand, now he was their stepfather. And even though Linda had been married to Billy, she at times would move back in with John, and John was always ready to, take her back in. John also received disability checks, which was considered one of the, if not the biggest motive for the crime, but that didn't really add up. So I'm going to really just get back into the recap of the case. I do want to give my normal disclaimers in that some of the topics that we cover may be difficult to listen to, so viewer or listener discretion is advised. All of the sources that I used will be linked in the description. Some of the sources may be behind a paywall, but I will leave the name and date of a newspaper if they are behind the paywall in case you have, say, an individual subscription to that newspaper. I usually use newspapers.com, but you may, have your own your own subscriptions to more local newspapers if you are from the area. So getting into the crimes, John Charbonneau went missing. Now, of course, when anyone goes missing, usually a spouse or partner. Those closest to that person are the ones looked at. However, Linda would say that he was at jury duty. Now, in the previous episode, I mentioned how jury duty, at least in my most recent of many jury duty um, services that I've had to go to, how they most recently worked. So it was in many ways disappointing in how the police initially responded to the concern that some of John's family had expressed to them. However, later, Billy Sproates did begin to question some things. For one thing, Linda had asked Billy to put some boxes up in the attic at his place, and there was blood on them. Now, of course, knowing that his uncle was missing and he's now handling boxes with blood, he asked questions. He did get someone else involved who did start to move the gears of justice around a little bit more, but that in some ways may have ultimately led to his own demise. Now, as time does go by, police do begin to investigate more, and while examining John Charbonneau's home, which at one point was completely gutted by Linda, and when I say gutted, I mean blinds, carpet, cabinets, everything that could be taken from that home was taken. But the police noticed an area in the backyard that was disturbed. It was almost crying out to be seen because there were tires around it. And in that area, they found a grave that had a body. After the medical examiner examined the body, horrifyingly, it was found that the person was still alive and had actually breathed in the dirt. So a person was buried alive. The most shocking aspect of that, though, was it wasn't John Charbonneau whose house is where the body had been found, but it was his nephew, Billy. And from there, the police began to unravel a whole series of events where Linda, her daughter Melissa, Rachinsky, Melissa had been married previously, and I think her first husband, divorced her, probably because he felt like his time was probably going to be short, meaning that Linda had actually talked to him about killing John before. So I think he just kind of got out of there while he thought he still could. But Melissa had been seeing a man named Willie Brown, who did have a criminal history, who was arrested because someone has a criminal history who's directly related to the case. They're going to look at him first as well once they see the link to those closest to John and Billy. I do think Linda used a lot of things with Willie. Willie was African American, and it was stated that John had a big problem with that. There was also some reports that Billy did as well, though Billy's last day, when Willie had killed him, they had actually spent a part of the day together. Willie was at Billy's home. So in some ways, to me, that's kind of contradictory. But at a minimum, there do seem to be substantiated reports that John did have a big problem with that. And as in my opinion, I have to say, just to cover my bases, that Linda, it seems to me, manipulated all of these factors. She knew that things would point back to Melissa and Willie. To recap, another point regarding Melissa is Linda gave Melissa John's ATM card and PIN, which means when police were investigating the crime, they saw that Melissa had actually been using the ATM, which, given then the fact that John and Billy, let me say, Billy was found relatively quickly. And then from that discovery and interviewing Willie Brown, they were able to find John's body, which, again, relatively quickly when his disability checks were given as part of the motive. There were not many disability checks that Linda could have received in order to make it financially gainful. For one thing, she also did pay for some of Willie Brown's legal fees in another case. So, she really didn't come out ahead at all when it comes down to a financial motive. And this is about where I ended in the previous episode, along with, one question I had near the end was I wanted to know more about the time frame in regards to when exactly did they finish gutting the home of John Charbonneau, because on Billy Sproates' last night, he actually called Linda at John's home and there was an answering machine still there. So I'm thinking Linda had to work pretty quickly then after Billy was killed because, she had to have known that with both people missing, an uncle and a nephew, that there would have to be some, more investigations and even more urgent investigations coming after that, because with two people missing, possibly injured or deceased, they were going to ramp up the investigation going into the cases. And that is what happened, and that's where Willie did confess. Now, I did recap some in the previous episode that there were some discrepancies in the stories that Willie and Melissa gave. Now, Melissa did, say that she was there for some of the crime. She never admitted to actually, say, physically participating in the crime, meaning she never hit her stepfather or her father, and I'll just say Billy and John, that she wasn't the actual one who actually gave them any of the injuries that killed them. That was Willie Brown. He was the muscle, if you will. But Melissa was there. She drove a vehicle. She admitted to turning up the radio as she listened to her stepfather dying. So, she was, in my opinion, just as guilty because she didn't do anything to try to stop the murders. And while it was actually happening, instead of, say, coming to her senses and saying, Willie, we need to stop this, or Mom, we need to stop this, she let it continue and even turned up the radio to, drowned out the sounds of John specifically, as that was the killing that she said she turned up the radio, that she turned up the radio as the man that she knew as a father died, and as the man that she loved killed him at the behest of, according to the stories, their mother or her mother, Linda. Now, as with a lot of cases, even though the lead up to a crime may be interesting and complex and give someone insight into human nature and perspective, sometimes it's what happens afterwards that leaves someone in awe. And I have to say that's really, to me, what happened here as well. With Willie and Melissa both admitting to the crimes, though I think Melissa did admit to them in a way to try to lessen her culpability in it. The way she described things is she was less active in them. And even though she didn't yield any of the blows that killed either one, she was active to the point that she was, again, in my opinion, just as culpable in the crimes. But it's some of those discrepancies that kind of led to what would happen with the prosecution of her mother. As with many criminal cases, there's a plea that is brought to the table. And especially when there's a possibility of more than one person being involved, a lot of time these pleas are made in order to make sure everybody gets some sort of justice. And when I say everybody, I mean literally everyone from the victims, their families, as well as that each person involved at least gets some time in prison or what is the closest to a fair sentence that you can expect. I do sometimes think that the sentences aren't fair, but sometimes these are choices that prosecutors make in order to make sure that everyone at least serves some time. When looking at this case, there really is no way that many people could see both Linda and Melissa being able to, carry John's or Billy's bodies anywhere, to be able to bury them on their own, and then be able to clean up the scenes without some help, which is where Willie came in. He was the one with the muscle. He was a male, and let's face it, in a lot of these crimes, especially where there is more of a physical aspect, there is a male involved. With Willie's criminal history as well, this also gave the prosecution kind of more leverage with him. They could always bring up the possibility of the death penalty. He's already had this criminal history, and then he actively participated in the murder of two people, and these murders were planned. This was not a heat of a moment killing. And even after knowing that the initial blows did not kill them, he continued to kill them. So once they got to the graves, he, would continue to give them more hits, blows, to try to, quote, finish them off. However, as we heard in Billy's case, he didn't quite finish that. But in none of those instances, at no point in time did he stop and say, "This is insane. There's a man I'm getting ready to bury who's still alive. I'm hitting him to try to kill him before I bury him." And he doesn't realize, I need to stop now. So the prosecution could very well use that to their advantage, because if you put that story in front of a jury, the idea of someone being in a grave while still alive is terrifying. So that was used in his case. Now, Melissa, they also wanted to use her testimony. She didn't have a criminal history, so they didn't quite have as much to use as leveraged against her, but they were also being able to get a daughter to testify against her mother, and she said that she would do that. So after all that was said and done, Willie Brown was given a life sentence and avoided the death penalty. So that was kind of his consolation. Instead of going through a trial with the possibility of getting a death penalty, he then agreed to pleading guilty, but would serve the rest of his life in jail. Melissa was given 25 years with the condition that she would testify against her mother. And this is where I think, 25 years for killing two people, when there were so many different times where she could have stopped and said, this isn't right. I think 25 years is light. And even if the two men were not the best people, they didn't, like I said, there were some talk about John being discriminatory against Willie because of his race. And, that's abhorrent. But that's still a human life who could possibly change his mind at some point in time and hopefully redeem himself. And then Billy, she, like I said, looked at him as a cousin, I would think, for most of her life. And, there's not as much evidence to show that he had those same thoughts either. So there's not even the possibility of using a defense that either one of the men said or did something against Willie, and that was then, possibly done out of a heat of passion or, as a reaction to anything like that. These were cold, calculating murders that she did against people that she knew for her whole life. It was then in the summer of 2002 that Linda was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. By then, though, she had moved from Delaware to Vermont, where she was staying with family members. But she was extradited back to Delaware, and the charges levied against her left a lot of people in the small town of Bridgeville pretty shocked. Now, this is something that normally people would have expected to hear on the news about some town far away, or maybe even not even in real life, but as a made for TV movie. You might even sometimes see things such as based on true events when, watching a movie on Lifetime is probably the first one that comes to mind, Lifetime Movie Network, where they have all these sensational cases, based on these types of crimes that you don't really expect to hear. After Linda's arrest, it did take about 2 years for the trial to actually take place and to begin. It was in the March of 2004 when the trial commenced. And if the trial was happening now, I can almost see them happening on a YouTube channel. There are a couple that I watch where they're just dedicated to law, sometimes the psychological factors that lead to crimes. And they cover these cases where they get inside the courthouse. They really follow the case from start to finish. There's an attorney that I watch, Scott Reich, Crime Talk. He's an attorney, a defense attorney from Colorado. I can almost see this type of case being on his show. And that would all be like a day-to-day coverage. But this was not happening in 2004. So this was something that people would have to watch on the daily news to get updates. And while the bigger newspapers in the area, such as the News Journal, would come out daily and even twice daily, a lot of the local newspapers would only come out once or twice a week. So sometimes we weren't getting the updates on a daily basis, and we had to wait to find out what was going on. And with a trial like this, I just have to imagine people were waiting in the courthouse and waiting for the newspapers to come out to listen and hear about any salacious details that might be talked about in the courtroom, maybe secrets that people didn't know about. Or in this case, I have to wonder if everybody was waiting for that piece of testimony coming specifically from Melissa, wondering if a daughter would actually go in and testify against her mother, maybe even seeing it as a betrayal. So while Linda had been, in my opinion, kind of conniving or scheming to marry a much younger man once she kind of got tired of John Charbonneau, when she would actually come to court every day, she was kind of dressed almost like a grandmother, in my opinion, who seemed to be very down to earth and devout. She would walk in and have a Bible with her. Now, personally, just overall, I see any type of religion or belief system as a very personal and sacred belief, no matter what religion or spiritual belief someone might believe in. So we're looking at a woman who, honestly, at this point, I don't think many people had a doubt that she was somehow involved in the case, as far as the murders. And even if she wasn't, She also was married to a man and then left him for his much younger nephew. So it almost seemed to me like she was using the Bible as a cover, and that just kind of irks me. That she's trying to use that almost to show that she is this holy, devout woman who would never do anything to hurt anyone, when while she was married to one man, she's dating another and keeps going back and forth from her husband to her ex-husband and back and forth. So it almost seemed like she was trying to use that as a shield. And again, that just kind of that makes me mad. No matter what religion or belief system it is, it's like she's trying to exploit that. Or when people do things like that, they are trying to exploit another person or other people in the jury who may have a similar belief system as they do. It kind of makes it seem very insincere to me when someone brings something as overt as a Bible into a courtroom while they're carrying it. It's not, say, a piece of religious jewelry or some type of, whether it be a bookmark or a saying or something small that they can just hold on to for themselves. When it's a book that you can see from a distance is a Bible, it's like she's using that as a shield or a cover. Just my opinion. But what really made this contrast to the other woman involved in this, Melissa, was when she was brought in to testify. She was wearing shackles. So, in some ways, it could have looked very prejudicial to the jury. You see this one woman coming in looking very demure and grandmotherly in a way, whereas then you have this other woman coming in already showing that she has been convicted of a crime. And even though she pled guilty, that is the same as a conviction. But there were still protocols that needed to be followed, and Melissa had admitted to being part of 2 murders, so there had to be, these shackles, ways to make sure she wouldn't try to get away. So it would only have to be hoped that the jury could see beyond what they were physically seeing, beyond the grandmother versus convicted woman that was in front of them. So they did listen to Melissa as she recounted what Linda was like behind closed doors. She had described her mother as abusive and as controlling. When describing this, it was like it didn't matter whether the controlling nature was towards the children or even towards the men in her life. And as a surprise at this point in time, Melissa also stated that John's death, the idea of it, was not new just before it happened. She let the jury, let everybody in the courtroom know that Linda had been talking about and thinking about it for years, but she didn't really have anybody to help her with this. Going back to, when Linda had spoken about this to Melissa's first husband. So once Melissa did bring a man into her life who did have a criminal history, Linda did see this as a way to get what she wanted. Something else that we found out is Melissa said that Linda herself did help Willie when killing John Charbonneau. The description that Melissa gave seemed like, to me, like a scene out of an old cartoon or black and white comedy that you would see on TV, where Linda actually ended up hitting John with a frying pan. Now, in another surprise, someone who we didn't really hear about in this story a lot was that of Melissa's ex-husband again. He did take the stand, and we got a better time frame in regards to when Linda actually talked to him. And he said it had been about 2 years prior to John Charbonneau's death that Linda had spoken to him about it. The defense, when examining or cross-examining Melissa, tried to chip away at her story because of those discrepancies that had happened between her and Willie's confessions of the crime. Now, Melissa did add to her testimony in court. And what stood out here is that Melissa had testified previously that she was not involved, but was just listening to the radio during one of the killings. But in her court testimony, she actually added the part about her mother hitting John in the head with the frying pan. This then moved Melissa out of the role of her accomplice, or as an accomplice, and her mother into that role, whereas Willie had stated that Melissa was the accomplice. So I'm just going to kind of restate that there, as everybody's roles seem to change. Melissa had never mentioned the fact that her mother had hit John before. And the way everybody had been looking at this was more or less Melissa was kind of an accomplice in the background, ready to drive someone somewhere, help them clean up. Linda was the mastermind, and Willie was the one who, kind of did all the muscle. In Willie's testimony, or statements, I should say, because he didn't testify in court, in his statements, he said that Melissa really was the accomplice. And when Melissa added that her mother actually hit John, it put a different perspective on Willie's Willie's statement. I'm sorry if I keep saying Willie's testimony. If I say testimony again, I really mean statement. So it made a discrepancy in Willie's statement versus Melissa's testimony. So the defense focused on this. Now, to me, it's not a huge difference, but I can't say if I'm sitting there on that jury if it wouldn't make me question who's actually telling the truth. Melissa has just testified that her mother was controlling and abusive. Did she throw this in here to try to make her mother seem more guilty? Was Willie stating that Melissa was more of the accomplice because he was mad that she got him into that situation? So it brings up those little things, those inconsistencies that might make someone question what's the actual truth. And if you're trying to decide the course of someone's life as part of a jury, those little things might weigh a lot more than they would to someone who's just listening to them. Further, the defense did also bring up some of the things I've already spoken about, such as the financial motive behind John's killing, that, she could only really receive those disability checks for so long, and the fact that she gave Melissa the ATM card kind of negates that financial motive. No matter how they looked at the fact with the ATM card, when any of the withdrawals took place, Linda could be proven not to have been the person to make those withdrawals. So there really seemed to be no financial motive. The defense then wanted to point out that possibly it was John Charbonneau's racist beliefs that made Melissa and Willie act out on their own. And they looked at the financial motive then as kind of a bonus, that basically John's murder was on a personal basis for his beliefs, and there was also the financial motive, but it was for Melissa and Willie, not for Linda. So the defense focused on these key points and tried to make it seem like Linda really had nothing to do with the murder, and that as far as the ATM goes, a lot of spouses know what their spouse's PIN number is to the card. And if the murders had only been one, if it had just been John's murder, one might actually believe the fact that Melissa and Willie acted on their own out of, the reaction to John's beliefs, or trying to get money from him because, Willie had some other court expenses and legal expenses that he had to pay. So would that be a reason for them to kill John? But it was not just John. And that to me is where the defense really loses a lot, if not everybody, on the jury. Even if Billy did share the same racist beliefs with his uncle, then would there be a financial motive for Melissa and Willie to kill him? This is where someone else who is sometimes seen as a controversial figure is brought into the story, and that is Linda's son, Willard. And I know at some point we have a Billy, we have a Willie, we now have a Willard, and Billy was short for William, so we have a lot of people with similar names, but Willard was Linda's son, Melissa's brother. When Willard was on the stand, he said that he had spoken to Billy Sproates, and I'm kind of backtracking with the time frame. He probably figured that he was one of the last people to see Billy, or had spoken to him before he died. And during some of the conversations they had leading up to Billy's disappearance and death, the two men had talked about the boxes. Billy mentioned to Willard that, his mother, Linda, had given them boxes that had blood on them. And Willard, well, he kind of told that to his mother, which probably consequently led to Billy's death. This then gave a motive as to Billy's death. If there had been any question about whether or not Linda would have known that Billy was questioning a lot of things, Willard kind of, I don't want to say threw his mother under the bus, but at the same time, it did give her the motive to want Billy gone. After testimony and closing arguments were made, the jury deliberated for about 13 hours. So it did seem like they looked at all the evidence, that they looked at the cases individually, in my opinion. That's what it seems like. It wasn't just a very quick, either she's guilty or not, that they did take time to look at the case. It was a complex case with close family members. It had to be difficult for those family members to testify against each other or to accept the fact that one family member killed another. But after those 13 hours, the jury found Linda Charbonneau guilty on 2 counts of murder, and she was consequently given the death penalty. Now, with any case involving the death penalty, you know that there are a lot of appeals, there are different motions that are filed. The case is picked to pieces. And given that the defense already did point out a few pieces of, information that could kind of bring doubt to some of the events, that right there kind of gave them an opening on what to start questioning. And of course, that's exactly what they did. I have seen some interviews where someone is given the death penalty and an interview is then done with a close family member. And the family member, even if they do want the death penalty, they may even just say at some point, I just want it all to be over, so I'm okay with life in prison. Because there are just so many appeals and court processes that it goes on for years, if not decades. And that's why, if you're someone listening from a different country, some people who are on death row never actually get to the death penalty portion of their sentence. They die on death row before the execution is ever actually done because of all of the hearings and motions and appeals that are filed after, the case is finished. So things get extremely complicated after, the sentence is delivered. Now, there are a few pieces of documentation that I went through quite extensively, and I'm not going to go over them piece by piece by piece because that would take forever. Um, but one was the initial, is basically the penalty phase, where there's information given on how the jury came to the conclusion that the death penalty was warranted. In some previous cases, we've looked at what's called aggravated factors versus mitigating factors, and the aggravating factors have to outweigh the mitigating factors. So, depending on the state that someone is in, the aggravating factors may vary, but there are very specific criteria that are given usually that have to be met in order to have an aggravating factor, such as um, was it planned? Was it for a financial motive? Was there a particular type of weapon used? A number of different things. Mitigating factors could be things such as um, being abused as a child, being abused by the person that was killed, things like that. And so the documentation basically just recounts the case, but then also looks at what's called non statutory aggravating factors. And what that means is those weren't factors that are actually like delineated by the state, um, but ones that can be looked at as something that contributed to the crime by the actual criminal or defendant themselves. And in Linda's case, they looked at the fact that there was evidence provided that she had actually victimized the two men before, that there were reports she had been abusive to them, that there was financial motivation for John's murder, that the this was again, non-statutory, but that there was an impact on the victims' families after they died. But I think that's something that is pretty much, should be in every case. There's always impact to friends, family, and loved ones when someone is murdered. And the fact that, at least as proven by this evidence, there was no provocation by John or Billy. And this is just my feeling. I think that was put in there to show that it didn't seem to be a reaction by Willie, which is what the defense was trying to say. Um, it sounded like the defense was trying to put forth the idea that Willie reacted based on John and possibly Billy's beliefs. And so an aggravating factor was the fact that there was no provocation by John or Billy. But the defense countered with mitigating factors such as there was no criminal record, she had a solid work history, and also then looking at the sentences of Melissa and Willie. And this is where the fact that she had no criminal record, whereas Willie did, comes into play. That she cared for her grandchildren, and that in the time that Linda had been in prison, she had been noted to have good behavior. But after the jury weighed all of this, they still determined that she should be given the death penalty. When looking at the factors, they said 10 to 2, so 10 jurors versus 2 voted for the death penalty in John's case, and 9 voted for it in Billy's versus 3 who said no. So, in weighing that evidence, the death penalty was upheld. But that's not where it ends. Here comes then future motions that are filed to the courts. And in 2010, June of 2010, there was a motion put forward to the state. And there seems to be a lot going on between the last piece of information I went through to this that is not recorded in documentation that I can find. After going through the penalty hearing, there were more motions filed. And in 2007, um, there was an actual plea that Linda took to reduce the time that she would have to serve, which, in essence, nullified the death penalty. And this was because she filed a motion that her trial was an unfair trial. And this is where things come in about Willie Brown, Melissa, and the discrepancies in their stories and whether or not Willie had testified. We know that Willie didn't testify, and that becomes a key factor here. So the courts did find that she had an unfair trial, but Linda had wanted to have an automatic, basically, decision made that she should have been acquitted. But the court said no, that we can't just say that it should have been an acquittal. So it was going to have to go back to trial. And instead of doing that, in 2007, that's when she said that she would plead guilty to the murder of John Charbonneau. But all of the other indictments that were made against her weren't really dropped, but to use the English translation of the legal term, it basically means that they weren't going to pursue the other crimes. So automatically that dropped, the sentences that she had, and she was sentenced to 20 years. And she, of course, received credit for the time she had already served. The 20 years was to be spent at a level 5 detention center. And then after that, she was supposed to spend 6 months at what was considered level 4 or work release. But we always know that there are things such as probation or other terms that may allow someone to get out of prison early. And in her case, the first 10 years had to be served no matter what. But we already know that she had some time served in there. So Linda did plead to this. She accepted that, but then she also asked that after 10 years, that the remaining time be suspended. But the court did deny that in November of 2007. However, in June of 2010, another motion was filed, and that's where we are now. Thankfully, this motion did denote some of the history because I couldn't find it in other places. So at least that gave me some information that I needed to find out how we got to this point. And one part of this motion couldn't have been filed until 2010 because there was a law that changed in 2009. And there can be motions filed under what's labeled or called, quote, new rule of law, end quote. But in 2009, there was something called, again, quote, bit players in major felonies, like murder, will no longer be automatically treated as if they were the primary lawmaker, end quote. So to me, this kind of reads like, you may have heard the term felony murder charge. And what that means is if, say, 3 people broke into a home and their idea was just to rob the home, and one person went out on their own and they committed murder or a more violent crime, there would be, in many states, a law that would say all 3 would be sentenced or treated the same way because they all planned the original crime. And that's how it reads to me, is that this change in law was saying that if someone was not the major person in a felony, in this case like murder, they would not necessarily get the same or as severe felonies as those who were considered primary in the crime. And we also have to remember, too, here that Linda only pled to the murder of John, not Billy. So given this factor, she says that her role in the crimes mean that she was not as at fault as the other people, Willie and Melissa. So she's saying because she was part of John's crime, she was a factor in it, but she should not be held as responsible as Willie and Melissa. And lastly, in this motion, she's saying that even though, the mandatory is 10 years then for the murder of John Charbonneau, according to her plea, that then she should qualify for a suspended sentence for the rest of that time. She did want to keep her plea in place, and this tells me she had some very good lawyers, because if she decided to take back her plea, it would then put her in a position where she could be retried. So she and her lawyers were using every bit of maneuvering that they could to keep the plea in place, but get her out of jail early. However, they kind of overlooked one thing the attorneys did. There was never actually any law that said that bit players wouldn't be treated the same way as other people who committed the crime. So honestly, when I read that, I'm thinking, how could anybody filing this motion make the mistake like that? Like that seems something pretty major to miss. But what the court thought she may have been trying to say is that there was some case law where when there are certain degrees of a crime, such as first degree, second degree murder, that somebody can look at an individual and say, even if they were part of the same crime, that one person involved might be, first degree, whereas another person might be second degree, so that they would be looked at more individual, not as part, of the same crime and getting the same indictments and punishment. So overall, at least in this particular motion from 2010, the courts denied the motion because first the motion was filed as a post-conviction relief, which she did not meet the criteria for, in that it seemed like she was looking for a sentence reduction, which the filing was untimely. So this was denied, but the story doesn't end here either. Because if you've been doing the math, you may have realized we are now past 20 years since Linda was indicted and extradited from Vermont back to Delaware. Linda was released from jail or prison, I should say, in 2022. So she is now out amongst everybody else. Melissa was due to be released from prison in April of this year, of 2024, but I was not able to find anything specifically to say that she had been released. So I don't have any updates as to Linda's location right now, if she moved back to Vermont with some of the other family members, if she's still here on the shore. As I've been recording this, I'm kind of hoping she's not or doesn't know where I am. That's just my personal opinion, though. So I do just want to say, though, that there is, a lot of detail into all of the legal proceedings after the actual trial and the initial penalty, though I did find other documents, not from the actual courts. There was a lot of information on one site called Murderpedia that does a lot of copying and pasting, it seems, from different sites. So I am going to leave a link there as well, which does give some of the other information, but I just tried to hit on some of the key points that I could corroborate through other pieces of information. But if you have an afternoon to read through everything, that's kind of an interesting read. But after all is said and done, Melissa served a little bit more time than her mother, and Willie is in jail for the rest of his life. And it does kind of make you wonder, if Willie never met Melissa, would he have gone on to commit other crimes, or would he have gone on the straight and narrow and be out there and be a productive member of society? Now, I'm not saying this in any way to negate his part of the crime, because he was the actual active participant. He is the one who committed the murders and buried the two men. But at the same time, it just kind of makes me question the influence of one person upon another, in, what someone may or may not do with their lives. If one chance meeting, could change the outcome of a person's life. And one might argue that he had a criminal history, but at the same time, it didn't seem, from at least the information I found from the previous criminal history, that it would have automatically seemed like he would have, committed a more violent crime later on. So that's, sometimes I leave an episode having a question that just kind of lingers, and that's what lingers here for me. So, thank you very much for tuning in, everyone. I know it's been a long time coming with this episode. And I forgot to mention earlier, if there's a little bit of problem with the sound, when I went to record this, I found that I was missing a part of my microphone, which may make it seem just not as filtered or clear. So I'm going to try to clean that up, but I apologize. I do have another piece on order, but it won't be here for a few days. And I knew I had time to record this now and wanted to get it recorded. So thank you very much for tuning in. I hope everybody has a good holiday season if I don't talk to you before then. And I will talk to you as soon as I can. Bye.